Hey there, my friends, tarot nerds, and all other kinds of nerds. Welcome. I have a new video tonight, a new tutorial for you, and this is something that's been kind of majorly important to me over the years, something that I've been talking about a lot, and it's something that I want to kind of evangelize about, really, and that's how to give really precise answers when we're doing tarot readings. And so I'm going to share some tips with you. The first thing I want to say, though, is that this is really a goal, and it's not a destination. And I guess by that I mean you're constantly working on this. This is something I've been working on for 3 or 4 years, and I think I've gotten better at it. But there are times where I'm really bad, and there are times where I'm really good, and they're not really related to whether or not I'm a good reader, I guess. I think it has a lot to do with my mood, how much energy I'm willing to put in, all of those things. So I want to share with you some tips, and I want to share with you some techniques, and I want to share with you just a little kind of fun methodology for you to try to make your readings super precise, particularly when you have a question. And we'll have a little fun, but I think that this is a really kind of important and useful skill to develop, and it's something that friends and I have been talking about a lot. So the thing that made me start thinking about doing this is that Lenormand kind of arrived on the scene. I think Lenormand has been, or had been, kind of bubbling up in the divination world for a fair amount of time before I kind of encountered it. I don't even remember, 4 or 5 years ago. And immediately this sort of reputation for Lenormand kind of came out, and it was getting all the cred for being like super precise, super clear, not super spiritual, not super mushy. And that conversation, those conversations kind of set me down a path that led me to where I am right now, but it also led to things like my book, Tarot on Earth, which is all about doing what we're about to do, particularly using pip decks, but you don't have to. And actually, in this video, I'm going to sort of reference both Marseille and Rider-Waite-Smith style decks. But the reputation was always that Lenormand didn't pull any punches. You could get really precise, really clear answers, and you didn't have to sort of dive into all the imagery. You didn't have to dive in. In fact, the imagery meant nothing. What was important was what the card said, what the meaning of the card was, but nothing more than that. And so we would do a reading for someone like, is she ever coming back? And the answer would be like, that's over, move on, as we have here. So we have heart as the relationship, we have coffin as ending, and the ship is moving on. But I believed really strongly that wasn't necessarily a trait or a style that was exclusive to that particular divination system. It's just that particular divination system never got golden dawned, so to speak. No one ever came along and said, well, the ship is really reminiscent of the, the Egyptian Day of the Dead. I just totally made that up. That's not a thing. You know what I mean? But nobody ever did that with Lenormand because nobody was really paying attention to it. And it kind of arrived to us, in essence, in a much, quote, purer form because it hadn't been golden dawned. But I do think tarot can do the same thing. And if you look at these spreads that I've created here, they really say exactly or more or less the same thing that the Lenormand reading here is. Look, wake up. If you look at the Marseille one here, wake up, the relationship's done, the relationship's dead. Or if you look at the Rider-Waite-Smith there, yeah, that relationship was nice. It's kind of run its course and you got to move on. So I think that we can be as terse and precise with tarot as we can be with any other system, be it Kipper or Lenormand or Sibylla, which I'm a fan of. I think that the system matters so much less than the approach we take. Now, this is never to say, and I've said this before, it's never to say that a spiritual reading or a meditative reading or any of the kinds of things that tarot has become known for, that's not bad. We're not bad for doing that. It's just that you have the option to add this to your toolkit too. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. And so what I really want to focus on is really the difference between what I call mushy or imprecise readings and precise readings. Precise is a word that I've kind of appropriated from Camellia Elias, but I only encountered her work sort of as part of my journey into the world of more precise, more practical reading. In fact, her work was recommended to me by several folks who were like, well, if that's where you're going, then you need to look at what she's making, and they were right. And I've studied her Lenormand class, but I think that you can get the same result with tarot. So here's the High Priestess, a card I always think gets kind of mired in spiritual kind of muck when people read. Now, I'm going to use some language and I'm going to be kind of snarky in my way. Like, I don't take this personally, because I'm only talking about what I'm talking about because I've done this too. Otherwise, I wouldn't really care, because I would be like, well, what's hard? This is hard. This is a transition. It's a different toolkit. It's a different way of learning. So what's a mushy reading? So our question here is, how can I make sure my tarot business succeeds, right? Excuse me. And so the answer to the question is the High Priestess. And so the mushy answer is, follow your intuition. You know what to do. Now, I've given answers like this and I've gotten answers like this, and I don't find them incredibly helpful. I find them mushy. I don't think that tells me anything I didn't already know. In fact, if I knew what my intuition was telling me, I wouldn't be asking you. You know what I mean? Like, I just fucking do it. You know what I mean? So what we're after when we have a practical question is a precise answer. And so what our aim is, now this is just an example. You may find this not super precise because all of these things are relative, right? But I look at the High Priestess and I look at this question and I say, what is the High Priestess telling me? What are all the things I know about the High Priestess? And so the question, or the answer that I came up with to this question, is that you want to assume that your clients want you to be mysterious and slightly inapproachable, super magical, and very exclusive. So you want to think about your clientele and what they're going to want from you. And what they're going to want from you is that you embody the High Priestess, so that you're kind of mysterious, you're kind of magical, and not everyone has access. They want to feel like when they get time with you that this is special. And that's a little bit more precise. That's a little more actionable. That's a brand. Whereas follow your intuition, to do, like, that's not actionable, because if I knew what I needed to do, I would be doing it. So how are we going to do this? How are we going to make our readings more precise? Let's find out. All right. I've boiled it down to 8 kind of simple steps. And they are, first, make sure that the question is clear and that you understand what it's trying to achieve. And we're going to get into all of this much more deeply. Then make sure you really understand the question. I think the question, I say this all the time, and I'm as guilty as anyone of being really lazy about questions. But as a reader, when we really understand our question, when we understand how it functions and what it's asking, we automatically, dramatically increase our opportunity for a precise answer. So make sure we understand the question, make sure we understand what it's trying to achieve, and then do that again. Then you want to choose a spread that's right for the question. Interpret the cards in the context of the question. You want to put it all together. And then you're going to go back and compare the answer that you've come up with to the question that was asked. And then you're going to do something that I think is really helpful. I think this is something that's really a useful barometer. You're going to say, how would my boss respond to this answer if this were my job? If I were at work and my boss said, hey, blah, 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 this thing. If I came back with this answer, how would my boss respond? And then finally, you're going to sum it up. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit too. All right, so let's dig in. All right, so the first thing we want to do is we want to make sure the question is clear and that we understand what we're trying to achieve. And there's a lot to be said about questions. Much more goes into the phrasing of a question than we realize. And so what we want to do is we want to figure out a few things. We want to figure out what kind of question it is. We want to figure out what kind of answer we're looking for and how detailed the answer needs to be, right? So the first thing is it a yes or no question? Yes or no questions are, controversial in tarot. I'll take a little sip here. They're controversial in tarot. Some people do and some people don't. Some people find them useful, some people don't. That's not the point, though. The point right now is that's a specific kind of question that you want to be aware of. And you also want to be aware of whether yes or no suffices, or if why matters. A lot of people don't just want to know if something's going to happen, even though they say that. They also want to know why that's the answer, because if they don't like the answer, then they're going to want to try to change it. Questions have subtext. Very rarely are people capable of articulating the thing they want, either because they don't know what they want or because they're embarrassed to admit what they want. So for example, they might ask you a question like, does so-and-so still think of me? And really what they're asking, of course, is, did I ever matter to anybody? Like, what's my value? And so it's important to think not just about the question on its surface level, but also to try to think a lot about what they're really asking you. And when they ask about an ex and they're saying like, do they ever think about me? What's really underneath that is this emotional thing of like, did I really have value to them? Or was that just a passing thing? Do they think about me still? And implies underneath it a sense of longing, and maybe it's a longing to get back together. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's a fear. Maybe they're still thinking about me and I don't want that. So the more context you have, obviously, the better. But it is helpful to think about like, what's the question underneath the question. And then what are the words that clue in what they're really asking for? So, these are words: will, can, should, does or do, am, will I, can I, should I, do I, am I, or will they, do they? Those are all ultimately yes or no questions, right, that we're working with. We're thinking about, a yes or no answer there. If there's a when, that's a timing question. And how do you handle timing? Like, it's helpful to know that beforehand. Do you handle timing from a seasonal way? Do you look at the seasons associated with the suits? Or is it conditional? This will happen when these conditions are met. Knowing both that's what's at the heart of the question and how you handle when questions is helpful. And that's something that's worth spending some time about, thinking about. How something is usually advice, where obviously is location, and how do you handle that? If you get a where question, how do you identify a location in tarot? And why is an explanation. And with all of these too, you want to think a lot about how willing you are or what your style is. Are you an advice giver? Do you give advice? Are you like, yep, this is what you need to do? Or are you an empowerer? That's hard to say. Empowerer. Are you someone who says, well, I can't tell you what to do, but, here are some things you can think of. Knowing that, of course, ahead of time is good so that you know how to give an answer that makes sense. So then once we've explored the question, what kind of question it is, what we're really after, what we're really looking for, make sure we really understand. Like, don't just assume, okay, I've done this work, this means this, I got that, I think I got that makes sense. Like double check, do I really understand this question? Is this really what folks are asking for? And I think that's important just because I do this all the time. Like, I'm like, oh yeah, I know that. Okay, got it. And that, that's arrogance on my part, but it's not always the case with everybody. But it does help to just say, okay, all right, I figured this out. Let me just go back and say, is this really what I think it is? Now, once you've done that, you want to choose a spread that makes sense for the question. And this is super important. I see a lot in readings with particularly, well, I was going to say folks who are new, but it's not. Like, oftentimes I find people just picking a spread because it's their go-to spread. It's not a spread necessarily that answers the question. And I think it's really important that the spread actually answer the question that you're asking, because it makes it so much harder to do a reading if the cards aren't answering the question that you asked. And I think that there's a lot of, like, I don't know, there's a lot of sense of like, I don't know how to say this now that I'm sort of going down this path. I think people go with what's comfortable and not necessarily what's right. And I actually really strongly believe that it's better to have no spread than the wrong spread. Because I think if you're using no spread, then the cards don't have any positional context, and then so fine, it doesn't matter. But if you use the wrong spread, then you're actually doing a reading where the cards are taking you away from what's been asked because you're answering completely different questions. So it's like, do you want to have no spread and let the cards answer the questions, or do you want to have the wrong spread that's taking you in the wrong direction? And I really, truly believe that the spread matters, and that choosing a spread that actually answers the questions is so key. And I do tend to get a little judgy when folks don't do that. because it's part of the job. I think it's part of the gig, is to choose a spread or to choose cards in context, or that allows context to make the answering make sense. And I also think that if you're not doing that, you're just making your job harder. And that's no fun. Like, why make your job harder if you don't need to? So if you're not sure if the spread that you've chosen really actually answers the questions that you're working with, like, go through and look at the positions in the spread and really look at each one and say, do any of these actually answer the question that I'm asking? You know, so in like the example from my previous slide here with the sort of surfer lover guy, you know, the question is which, you know, who do I choose? And like, if I do a past, present, future spread, the cards don't answer that. You know what I mean? Like, the future card might, like, you could say, what's the state of the future? But it's confusing. It's not precise. It's mushy, because those cards, that spread is not getting you closer to the answer that you asked. It's answering different questions. What's the past? What's the present? What's the future? Now, you might be able to weave those into an answer. A lot of people do, but I think why, you know, why use a spread that doesn't answer the question when you could, and then have to like do the extra work of figuring out how to weave it into an answer when you could just use a spread that actually answers the question. And I just, you know, this is just one place where I get really passionate and obviously a little judgy, but I think that, you know, not all spreads are right for all situations. And I talk about this a lot. In fact, a lot of what I'm talking about in this video are things I've talked about a lot, because they are, I think for me, they've become kind of the essential hallmarks of doing a reading. So once you picked your spread and you know that the spread is going to answer the questions, then you need to interpret the cards in the context of the question that was asked. And again, this isn't new. If you watch my channel, I talk about this a lot, but it is super duper important. It is to me, you know, the question and the context, like, without those two things, our job is so much harder. But if we have those things, it's so much easier. So we have to think not just of what we associate the cards with, but what we associate the cards with in a question. And it changes, you know, it moves. The cards are elastic. The meaning is elastic. The suits are elastic, you know. And so what I've done here in this little example is and this was done really quickly, but you can spend a lot of time doing this. But it's good to have this in your back pocket. It's good to have this in your reading arsenal, in the back of your mind, so that when you are doing a reading, you're able to sort of think contextually about the cards, not just what you learned in the book that you liked. You know, so each, you know, one of the, I talk about this a lot too. One of the things I used to do when I was starting out is that someone would ask me about their love life, and I would get a wands question, and I'd be like, no, your work is important. You need to write that novel. But that's not, I don't believe anymore that the cards tell us different things. I believe that the cards answer the question that we asked. And so wands in a relationship question have to respond to the relationship question. They just have to. That is a rule that I now really firmly believe strongly. And I've done other videos on that. And so if it's a love life question, then the suits, the meanings of the cards change into relationship, or change in relationship to the question. And so if wands comes up, then I think about what wands means to me, or what they look like in this case, you know. And so there's passion and sex there, you know. Cups become cups. Swords might be about communications and fights, and pentacles may be about settling down, starting a family, kind of the daily nitty-gritty of a relationship. And you can do that. Now, I've done it in 4 like key areas here, 2 of which I don't even really do readings about, but I just wanted to give you the sense of, like, you know, the context really does change the meaning of the cards. And so if I am doing a health reading for some reason and wands come up, then I am going to think about heat. I'm going to think about fevers. I'm going to think about heartburn. If it's swords, I'm going to think about pain or the brain. If it's a legal issue, I'm going to think about swords as justice or a fight. You know, this is going to be a real fight. So interpreting the cards in the context of the question is so important. It really is going to be the bridge between the question and the precise answer. But if we stay married to our kind of rigid associations of like the Five of Cups always means like leaving behind, or losing or leaving behind a bad relationship or whatever, then that limits us, because I promise you there are going to be times where you're going to do a question about work and you're going to get the Five of Cups. And so you're going to have to contextually associate it. You're going to have to make it make sense in that way. And it's if the question has to do with a relationship at work, then maybe that makes sense, but it doesn't necessarily. And so it's important to kind of understand how the cards exist in different contexts. And so this is an example of one way you can do that. And then just individually, you think about the cards and you think about the question and you think about the characteristics and the archetypes and the myths and all that are associated. And you think about how do these people behave in different situations. So it's not just about the suits and how they behave, like how do the people in the tarot behave, the trumps and the courts? How do they behave when they're at home? How do they behave when they're at work, when they're in relationship, when they're in friendships? What are they doing and what are they displaying when they're negotiating or when they're communicating with one another? If they're in a fight, who's going to win, and why? And who ultimately is going to sort of trump the other. And that's something that's really important too. Think about the situation and the people and how they behave in the context. So what you know about the High Priestess, what you know about the King of Wands in the context of a relationship reading, in the context of a work reading, in the context of a legal battle. If the High Priestess comes up in the context of a legal battle, and the question, for example, is sort of what's going to happen, likely it hasn't been decided yet. The High Priestess does not give away answers, and there's probably things that are working under the surface. And there may be even someone exercising influence that we don't know about. So the answer may not be certain. With the King of Wands, on the other hand, may be like swift justice, right? Because fire moves fast, and it's going to be like quick gut reaction. The judge is going to react and say, boom, this, So how do these people behave based on what you know about them in the context of the question you're asking? And then once you do that, you kind of look at the cards, you figure out how they fit contextually and what you know about them, and then you just put it together. And here's where this is kind of the part where we get a little scared, right? Like we draw the cards, we know we have to look them in context. We've done the work, we've put in the effort, and then we draw the cards and it's time to put it together. And it's like, oh shit, I don't know what I'm doing, And when we're doing readings out loud, that gets scary because we have to kind of do the math. We have to do the work out loud. And that's when we start to sweat, But what we have to start with doing is like just thinking about what we know about the card in the context of the question. And so we start to think about like, okay, what does this card mean? What is this person doing? What is the action of the card? What is the emotion of the card? What do I know? And sometimes when we get stuck, it's just worth saying what we see, So for example, with the Magician, it's like all I can think of is like magic. Magic. I don't know. But we start doing the work, and this is the hard part, especially when we're doing a reading out loud. And if you're anything like me, if you've watched my channel at all, you know that my thoughts tend to be kind of discursive, and I tend to sort of do a lot of thinking out loud. Which is one reason why I've always said I prefer written readings, because they allow me to do all of that behind the curtain and then come back and look like a genius, And so when we look at a spread of cards, we're like, if we look at this last spread, like, okay, you're clinging and like, it makes you feel hurt, and that, oh God, what's that Magician doing? Like, I don't know. Like we just sort of work this stuff out. And when we're doing a reading face-to-face or even on video, it's tough because all of that is happening out loud. And even sometimes you might get a hit and it's like, oh, it doesn't make any sense. Like, oh, wait, that's, and like, oh no, that's not it. That doesn't make sense. But again, we have to go back to the golden rule here. There's a very important golden rule that I repeat in many, 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 many of my videos. And that completely makes reading so much easier, and that when we forget it becomes really hard, is that it's about the context of the question. So when we're suffering, when we're struggling, what we have to do is we have to return to the context of the question. And in this case, the question was this kind of patriarchal dude wanting to know which bride to choose. So let's remove the patriarchy for a second and let's look at what this person's really asking, right? So we've got, which person will I be happiest with? That's ultimately what this surfer dude is saying. You know, who am I going to be happiest with? I have two people to choose from. Who am I going to be happiest with? So that's what we've got. This is the distillation of the question. And so we know it's about a choice between two people. And what we also want to do, again, like I said at the beginning, is think about what the implications are, what the subtext is. Which person will I be happiest with? Which is a word that comes right from him, you know, which person will I be totally happy with? The thing is, like, he's assuming that there's a state of being that's inevitable, you know, that happiness is possible with either of them. A lot of people do this, you know, when am I going to meet my soulmate? When am I going to get married? When am blah, blah, blah. Those questions make an assumption about something that may or may not happen. You know, it doesn't happen for everybody. So our bro here may not actually ever get married or ever be happy with anyone. But the question he's asking is, who am I going to be happiest with? So I have to kind of look at the question and then I have to look at the cards. And so I know, you know, I had these sort of like little keywords and phrases that I came up with as I was like doing the math. But now I'm looking at the cards and I'm like, okay, look, there's two people here in this reading, right? And I know that he's choosing between two. And I have a state of being. Now, this is completely accidental. I did not choose this question and these cards to do this. I just randomly picked them. But it worked out that way. This just happened to have two people cards and a card that represents a state of being. Now, when I divorce myself from everything I know and I just look at the cards in the context, things start to get a little more interesting. There's two people and a state of being. That Three of Swords, I may interpret many different ways, and I may not particularly love the Rider-Waite-Smith interpretation of it, but that's the deck I'm using right now, and these are the cards I've drawn, and that state of being is not happy, regardless of what the person assumes. This guy assumes that he's going to be happy just because he thinks he's entitled to it, for example. Excuse me, but the two people in this reading, no one in this reading is happy. So what do we get? None of them are going to make him happy. One of them is too greedy and the other one's too woo-woo for him, and he's going to be unhappy either way. And so there's this interesting thing that happens when people make assumptions, and as a reader, we have to kind of look beyond that. We have to look at the cards and listen to what they're telling us in the context of the question. Now, I am particularly guilty of wanting to tell people what they want to hear. Like, even with our surfer bro, you know, that's really not fair. Even with our sort of Renaissance bro here, you know, I want everyone to be happy. So I want him to be happy with somebody, but the cards tell me that that's not the case. The state of being of this reading is not happiness, and neither of these people are contributing to it. And so both of them are going to not make him happy. My job as a reader is to say that, you know, look, neither of these people are right for you right now based on this reading. One of them is to this, the other one's to that. And maybe there are things about him that are at play too. In fact, if you look at the implications that I've made, one's to this and one's to that, probably means that he's actually too judgmental. But the fact that he's too judgmental doesn't negate the fact that neither one of them are going to make him happy, because they're both going to irk his judgmental qualities, right? So we've answered the question. We've come up with our answer. We've gone through all that stress. Now what we have to do is we have to go back and compare the answer back to the question. Did we answer it? Is it right? Does it fit? And so the question was, which person will I be happiest with? And the answer is neither. That's a good answer. It fits. It actually is contextually right. It makes sense. It doesn't necessarily reflect what he wants to hear, but it's a good fit. It's a match. And so that should give us confidence, right? That's like a good thing. Like contextually, the kind of question that we asked, which is, which will I choose, right? Which was a choice between two things, and the answer is neither. And so that fits. Now, here's a filter that I really like to run my readings through. And you could phrase this in different ways, but this to me is like the most, I don't know, like the easiest way to think about it, regardless of what we do for work. It's like, what would my boss say about this answer? You know, would they accept this answer from me if I were at work, if this were on a data report, if this were on some kind of board meeting progress report. Like, is it clear? Is it accurate? Is it actionable? Does it keep with the question? And is it satisfying? Or is it entirely based on generalities? Have I gone with what feels easy, not necessarily what feels clear? Is it vague? Is it mushy? Is it imprecise? And just because the answer I came up with may be some of those bad things doesn't mean that I don't now have the opportunity to refine it. So if, for example, I find that it is general, it is vague, it is mushy, then I can go back and look at the cards. I can go back and look at the context. I can compare them, and I can keep digging. There's no, unless you're charging by the minute, and if you're reading on the phone lines, which is a real practical concern for a lot of readers, or, you're trying to get readings done real fast. Time shouldn't necessarily be the trump. It shouldn't be the thing that stops you. The right answer, the satisfying answer, the clear, precise answer should sort of be the ultimate goal. And so unless, you are charging by the minute, then you can go back and say this makes sense. This doesn't make sense. Let me dig deeper. Let me find more information. And honestly, I would say, if you're finding that more often than not, your readings are a little mushy, probably you wouldn't be ready to hop on the phones. That's probably not something that you would enjoy, because the stress of getting things done quickly is obviously going to get to you. But I like this idea of thinking about, will my boss, if this were work, if this were a report, you could think about it as a teacher or a parent or a lover or whoever, would someone else be satisfied with this if this weren't a tarot reading? Where were you last night? Well, I was out pursuing my intuition. Okay, you're cheating on me. You know what I mean? Would they be okay with that answer? Probably not. And then you just sum it up. You know what I mean? You've done a lot of stuff. If you're doing the reading face to face, if you're doing the reading out loud, whether it's on video or on the phone or, in real time in a tent or, at a conference or whatever, you've probably rambled on a lot of, as I have in this video. You've said a lot of stuff. And so, what's important now, though, is that you sum it all up. You say, okay, here's everything I know. Now, let me tell you the answer. So everyone, client, surfer guy, Renaissance bro, I said all this stuff. Your question was this, and the answer is this. Everything I said before was me getting to the answer. Your question was this, your answer was this. And so we end the reading by saying, here was your question, and the answer is this. And you just sum it up. And by that point, you should feel relatively confident, because you've done all that work trying to get there, trying to make sure the reading is precise, trying to get the answer to make sense in the context of the question. And I think that once you do that, and once you practice with that, you can start to feel more confident. Now, what I've done here is just to show you how context changes the answer. And I've done other videos about this, but what I did was I kind of took the same question and I asked it in different ways. And so if you look on the left, you'll see, when will I make up my mind? How do I make up my mind? Can I make up my mind? Do I need to make up my mind? Why can't I make up my mind? Where will I be when I make up my mind? So I've kind of gone back to those very early slides where I talked about the kind of question. And what I've done is I've given an answer that's based on these three cards, but that is adjusted and twisted that's twisted figuratively to meet the demands of the question that was asked. So if you look at the first one, when will I make up my mind? It's very different from the answer I gave with who should I choose, because it's a different question and the context changes. So when will I make up my mind? The card meanings all change. You're going to make up your mind when you stop being greedy and realize you'll lose something, and then you'll find your power. How do I make up my mind? Let go of everything. Let go of needing everything or keeping everything to yourself and worrying you'll get hurt, and put some energy into making up your mind. That was the how. Can I make up my mind? Yeah, if you stop being so needy and worrying about your feelings and manifest your destiny. Do I need to make up my mind? If you keep everything to yourself, if you keep both of them, they'll leave you and they'll find their power. Why can't I make up my mind? Because you're being selfish, you don't want to lose out, and you think your magnetism makes it okay. So the magician takes on a very different context there. Where will I be when I make up my mind? Where questions I don't get all that much, but it does pose an interesting conundrum as a reader. You're going to be in a place, I tend to do conditional where questions in a play, especially for where and when. I tend to do conditionally. In a place where you will be able to keep what you need and grow your mind and stop lying to others. And again, the magician takes on a very different context there. I go to a very old-fashioned kind of Marseille trickster liar quality there. So yeah, I mean, that's that. I mean, let me go back to our little summary. So, I mean, this isn't everything. And again, as I said at the beginning, it's a goal. It's not a destination. You're going to be better at this with some questions. You're going to be better at this at some times, but it does help. And so just to review, make sure the question is clear and that you understand what it's trying to achieve. Tease out all the little details of it and then double check. Make sure you really do understand it. Choose a spread that's right. Interpret the cards in the context of the question. Put it all together. Compare the answer to the question. So take the answer you've come up with, go back to the question, make sure it fits, make sure contextually it makes sense. Ask how your boss would feel about that answer, and then sum it all up. And if you do that, you should find yourself having much more precise readings, much less mushy readings. It does take time, it does take practice, but it's definitely doable. And I can say that as someone who has been working on this for a few years. So that is that. I hope this was helpful. I hope that this makes you feel like tarot can be as precise and clear as any other divination system. And I hope that you take this and run with it. So have a great night, be good, and we'll talk soon.